I'm probably breaking the law by writing this down. Of course, a priest is not allowed to tell anything that was said in confession, but I think this man is an exception. I need to tell someone. Anyone. I was a priest for quite a few years now, and I'd gotten used to the job. So when a man came into the church and went straight for the confession booth, I wasn't surprised at all. He didn't introduce himself, but that was not unusual either. Some people preferred total anonymity when they confessed their sins. I didn't get to see him properly. He wore a gray sweater and its hood was pulled deep into his face, obscuring all his features. Still, I didn't think too much about it. Just joined him in the booth like I was supposed to and greeted him with the same words I had spoken countless times already. He stayed silent at first. I gave him a bit of time because I thought he just didn't know how to begin. But after several minutes, I asked him what he wanted to confess. A few more seconds passed and then he spoke. He told me he had gone into the woods, and he said that in a tone as if I should have known that already. That was all. He didn't not elaborate any further, as if that would already count as a sin. I thought him to be a hunter then, asking for forgiveness for the lives of the animals he had killed. Maybe it had been his first hunt and the weight of the innocent lives was heavy upon him. I asked him to continue. He told me about a small clearing where the grass is greener than in the rest of the forest, and about the small cabin that stood on said clearing. Then he fell silent again. I asked why he considered this a sin. That made him laugh for a second, and the sound made my skin crawl. It was an ugly, manic laugh. He didn't explain his reasoning, just stood up and left. I was taken aback by all this. Sure, but I just assumed that it had been some weird joke. Either way, I was certain I'd never see the strange man again. I was wrong, of course. He came to the church the next day and walked straight to the confession booth once again, expecting me to follow him. Of course I did. That was my job, and also I hoped he would clear a few things up. I had thought a lot about his earlier confession. He only said he barely slept lately. I answered that I, too, struggle with insomnia, and asked once again why he considered this a sin. He laughed again. I wanted to tear my skin off. There was another person who visited the church frequently, outside of the services on Sunday. A young woman who always sat in one of the front rows and silently prayed for a while. We talked a bit sometimes, and she was very polite. I liked her. When she came by the next time, she told me how she felt watched in her own home, and she didn't feel safe there anymore. She prayed for that terrible feeling to go away, and I took the time to pray for her safety. The strange man came by every single day, and he always spoke 1 or 2 sentences at most. None of them were a sin. After just 3 days, he started repeating himself, talking about the woods and about his insomnia again. Always the same things, like a broken record. Even the wording was the same. The first change came the day after my conversation with the young woman, as he stayed silent at first. I asked him if he knew her, just because I had a bad feeling about him. He laughed. I bit down on my lip until I bled. He didn't say a word that day. The man was bad news and I knew it. His visits were going on for over a week at this point, and I had yet to see his face. He always wore that hood and he went straight to the booth each time. Sometimes I only saw him in the corner of my eye. There was no pattern in his arrival. I tried coming in sooner or later, but it made no difference. He came by a few minutes after I got there. He seemed to know when he had to arrive to meet me. After his strange reaction to my question, I was even more worried about the young woman. Knowing that a freak like him was out there made my insomnia even worse. I lay awake in my bed thinking about her. When I couldn't take it any longer, I drove over to her house because I felt like the least I could do was bless her apartment. I hoped it would make her feel better. She was reluctant to let me in at first. The poor thing, completely paranoid about something she didn't even know if it was real. She had never seen someone, she had told me earlier, but there had been the most intense feeling of being watched. I explained my intentions, and then she finally stepped aside and let me into the flat. She appreciated what I was going to do, she told me. She would indeed feel safer if someone blessed the house. Then at least she could be sure God watched over her. I intended to begin where the feeling was worst, her bedroom. It had a single window that faced towards the backyard. As I stood alone in that room and looked outside, I saw him standing there. He faced me, though his face was hidden under the hood of his gray sweater, and he stood perfectly still. We stayed like that for several seconds. He began to laugh. The window was closed, but the sound was so loud, as if he stood right beside me. I scratched my skin violently. The young woman burst into the room and yelled at me to leave. I tried to ask her if she knew the man, but she didn't let me speak a single word, just screamed at me that I should get out of her flat and never come back again. She cried and basically shoved me outside. I told her to call the police. She almost slammed the door into my face. She did call the police. They apparently found the suspect and questioned him, but he seemed perfectly sane and not at all likely to stalk someone, and they dropped the case again. There was no evidence after all. The man came to church as always, but after the police had gotten involved, the monotony of his confessions was changed. I remember his words clearly. "Don't try to lock me away, Father," he hissed, and his voice was cold and cruel and oh so angry. "I've been locked away for far too long." The young woman didn't come to church anymore. The monotonous confessions of the man continued every single day like a clockwork. The woods and his insomnia always told with the same words. I tried to catch him a few times to exit the booth at the same time as him, just to see his face at least. He was always gone by the time I exited. After just a few days, I decided to visit the clearing the man always mentioned. The grass was indeed greener around the small cabin, and as I walked up to the building, I had the most intense feeling of déjà vu. The stench of decay hung in the air. I was just about to touch the doorknob as intense vertigo hit me. I must have blacked out at this point, because the next thing I knew, I was sitting in the confession booth with the strange man on the other side. He asked me when I had last slept. I had no answer, and he laughed, and I dragged my fingernails across my face until I bled. The insomnia took its toll. I blacked out for short periods of time. A day later, I found myself kneeling in front of the altar, the gilded chalice with red wine in my hands, and couldn't remember how I got there. But I remembered that I had intended to pray for the young woman, and I did just that. Then rose the chalice to my lips and drank. The wine tasted off. I was hyper aware of the metallic taste that must have belonged to the chalice and wondered if it was growing rust. My prayers had no use though. I heard from another church member that the young woman had gone missing. I knew that she was dead, and I knew where she was buried, but I had not a single piece of evidence, and I didn't want to raise suspicion about myself, so I never called the police. God would judge the strange man, I told myself. He could not escape his punishment. The day after I heard about the woman's disappearance, the strange man was already waiting in the booth for me when I arrived. There was no visible clue that he was in there, but I was sure about it. And although I could have just turned around and went back home, what I probably should have done, I resigned to my fate and entered the booth. He spoke without hesitation this time, and these words are burnt into my mind by now. "Do you want to confess your sins, Father?" he asked, and he sounded smug and somehow satisfied. I stayed silent, not knowing what he expected me to say. I wasn't aware of any sins I had committed lately, none that would interest him at least. Instead, I wanted to ask him why our roles were suddenly subverted, but he started to laugh, and I tried to claw my face off again. A few days later, I met another woman at church. I had seen her at almost every service. We had never talked before, but she always smiled politely. She stayed behind after the latest service and asked if I was alright. Apparently, she was worried because of the deep, bloody scratches on my face, but I couldn't tell her the truth, so I said nothing at all. She was really nice. Said I didn't have to tell her, but that she was always there to talk if I wanted to. I have yet to accept the offer. The situation with the strange man didn't change. He was waiting for me every day when I entered the church, and each time he asked the same question. "Do you want to confess your sins, Father?" I never answered. He always laughed, and I scratched my face open until one of us got tired of it and left. It's been like that for 6 weeks now. I don't know what to do anymore. I can't remember the last time I slept. The strange man's laughter echoes through my head at any given moment. My skin is a torn mess to the point where I have trouble to get the blood out of my clothes. One of my favorite sweaters is ruined already. I know I should just not walk into the confession booth. I should stop talking to him, but I can't. I tried, and I always end up in that booth, tearing my skin open while he laughed. Maybe I should just confess my sins. If I only knew what he wants to hear. I will stop writing here. Maybe someone can tell me how to get rid of him. Until then, I have more important matters to take care of. The next service is soon, and we're all out of wine. I need to go get some more. I will never forget the day I found out I was pregnant. We had been trying for years and thought it was never going to happen, so when the second line showed up on that pregnancy test, I couldn't believe my eyes. I even made my husband run out and buy 2 more just to make sure. All 3 came out positive. Finally, this was the last piece in our puzzle we were waiting for. It was like a dream come true. We were already married and living in our dream home with a big back garden that was perfect for adventurous kids. In the middle of the garden, there was an old oak tree that they could climb. One of the first things we did was put up a tire swing on it. We knew it would be years before he would be able to use it, but with the thoughts of a little one running around, we just couldn't wait. We had to do something. My husband was like a big kid himself. He wouldn't shut up about all the adventures he was going to take him on, even though I explained to him repeatedly that it would be a few years before the baby would be able to do things like that. I just think he was happy to finally have someone to play with and forgot all about the baby stage. Until Harry arrived. Don't get me wrong, he was a good husband and dad. He did a lot for me during the pregnancy. When Harry was born, I needed an emergency C-section and there were complications. It took a while to recover from it. So for the first few months after Harry came home, Dan did nearly everything for him. From night feeds to changing diapers, which must have been hard. He is one of the most impatient people I know, so it was a bit of a challenge. It took a little bit of time for us both to adjust, I suppose. There were plenty of stressful days and sleepless nights too, but when I was back on my feet, we managed to get into our own rhythm. After that, everything went smoothly for us. Well, as smooth as it can be with a new baby in the house, I mean. I think he was almost 3 months old when I first noticed something odd. I was holding him in my arms while feeding him and staring into his beautiful blue eyes as usual, when suddenly he stopped feeding and just started staring at me with this strange look in his eyes, kinda like he was angry with me. I assumed it was just gas and put him on my shoulder to burp him. What happened next, I swear to you, is true. I was rubbing his back when he moved suddenly and slipped off my shoulder. Luckily, I caught him before he fell, but unfortunately, I pinched him with my nails in the process. He didn't cry or anything, he just made a growling noise. I gave him a hug and a kiss before putting him back up on my shoulder. A few seconds later, I heard him whisper something in my ear. It sounded like cunt. I just laughed. It had to be one of his little baby noises, I thought, and continued rubbing his back. Not long after, I heard it again. Cunt. This time it was loud and clear. I put him sitting on my knee and repeated, "Did you say a bad word, cutie? Did you? Did you?" jokingly in my usual silly voice. He stared into my eyes without breaking eye contact or even blinking with a strange look I had not seen before for about 5 minutes. I thought he might still have had some gas, so I put him back up on my shoulder and started rubbing his back with my hand. He started pushing his head closer and closer to my face, until he was near my ear. Then suddenly he grabbed onto one of my earrings with his mouth and started shaking his head. I tried to pull him away, but he would not let go. It was so painful, I thought he was going to rip it off my ear. But luckily I managed to open it before he got the chance. When I put him sitting back down on my knee, he spit it out and hit me on the side of the face, then smirked at me with this creepy grin. At the time, I thought it was just one big coincidence. I could never imagine he could have hurt anyone on purpose. How could I? He was only a baby. When my husband got home, I told him what had happened, and we both had a good laugh about it, but I never wore earrings around him again. The rest of that night was uneventful. It was my husband's turn to get up with him, so it was the next morning after my husband went to work before I was alone with Harry again. It was also the last day of my parental leave, so I was going to try to make the most of it and bring him to the park. He loved looking at the ducks.
Before I left, I decided to change his diaper. He was not happy about it. When I tried to undress him, he kept kicking me unusually hard. I didn't know what was wrong with him. I had never seen him like that before. When I finally got him fully dressed, he gave me the finger. I know what you think, just baby stuff. Well, that's what I thought at the time. Even though he looked into my eyes while grinding his, I would say teeth, but he didn't have any. For the rest of the day, he did not look at me once, not even when I fed him. That night it was my turn to get up and feed him, but I had trouble sleeping. I think I was just stressed with the thoughts of going back to work after that long break. I was just lying there when I heard something on the baby monitor. It sounded like someone muttering to themselves. I thought maybe our lines got crossed and we were picking up someone else's monitor, but I got up and checked on him to make sure. I sneaked quietly down the hallway so not to wake him and looked in through the crack in the partially open door. I was shocked with what I saw. He was sitting up looking around. I was amazed. He was not supposed to be able to do that for another few months, so I ran up and got my phone to record him. On my way back down, he screamed and frightened me. It was so loud I thought there must have been something seriously wrong with him. When I got there, I found him lying on the floor just inside the door. He had made so much noise he woke up my husband. He found me standing over Harry and thought I had dropped him. I tried to tell him I found him like that, but he just would not believe me. When my husband put him up on his shoulder to console him, Harry smiled over at me with, I know this sounds weird to say about a baby, but with a smug look on his face. After that, things went downhill for me. It seemed like any time I was near him, there were problems. From screaming when I touched him when my husband was around to pinching, scraping, or throwing things at me when we were all alone. I'm sure my husband thought I was hurting Harry on purpose, but he didn't say it to me. But he was always looking over my shoulder anytime I was near the baby. I tried my best to improve my relationship with him, but it was hard. I worked long hours, and he was usually in bed when I got home. The only time I got to spend with him was on the weekends. Even then, it might only be for a few hours, and I practically spent no time alone with him. Eventually, I felt like I had no choice but to take a step back from my responsibilities at work, which meant a demotion and a sufficient salary reduction. But at least I would get home at a reasonable hour. My husband was very supportive of my decision. He said he was just happy we would be able to spend more time together, which was nice to hear. For the first few weeks, everything couldn't have gone better. We were finally able to do things as a family. I even started to believe Harry was starting to warm up to me. He still looked like he was disgusted by me and tried to avoid eye contact, but at least he wasn't acting out when I wasn't near him anymore. Things were going good until a few weeks ago. My husband bought a new baby monitor with a camera. The other one mysteriously disappeared one night after putting Harry to bed. I really liked it. I was able to watch him sleep and got into the habit of watching the monitor every night before I fell asleep. Somehow, I think he knew, and he didn't like it. He started sitting up in his cot staring into the camera until I fell asleep. Anytime I tried to show my husband what he was doing, Harry would just fall back and pretend he was asleep before he got a chance to see him. The more I watched, the more it started to creep me out. It was like he could see me. I often dozed off. When I woke, I would see him scanning the room as if he were looking for something. Then he would quickly turn to the camera again and stare at me until I fell asleep. I always thought me and Harry's problems were caused by us not bonding properly when we came home from the hospital, and all the weird things that happened were just in my head, but I was wrong. Last night I woke to the sound of Harry laughing. When I checked the monitor, he wasn't in his cot. I tried to call my husband, but no matter what I did, he wouldn't wake up. I ran down and checked every part of his room, but he was not there. I was really beginning to worry at this stage. I was ready to call the police when I thought I heard a noise downstairs, but he wasn't there. So I ran back up in a panic to get my phone. Then I heard what sounded like mumbling. It seemed like it was coming from my room. When I opened the door, I was horrified with what I saw. Harry was sitting on my husband's chest with his hands over his mouth chanting. My husband's legs were shaking and he was struggling to breathe. I panicked and pushed Harry onto the bed and started doing CPR. The whole time, Harry laughed hysterically. For nearly 10 minutes, I did everything I could to save him, but nothing I did was working. I thought he was going to die. I was so scared. By the time the paramedics got there, he had stopped moving altogether. They got to work on him straight away and found a pacifier wedged deep in his throat. Luckily, they got it out just in time. They said if I didn't do CPR, he wouldn't have made it. Thank God he's going to be okay, but he will be kept in for a few days. The problem is now I am stuck at home with Harry, and I'm afraid of what he will do to me.
I'm a police detective, and I cover every mirror in my house at night. I became a detective a little over 1 year ago after spending 5 years on the beat. Any case I've worked on has always been clear-cut. No questions left unanswered. Concrete evidence. Confessions. But there was one case, is still one case, that leaves a lot of unanswered questions, questions of which, I suspect, may not have an answer grounded in scientific rationale. As a disclaimer before I begin, I'm not superstitious, nor do I believe in ghosts or anything that can be termed the paranormal. Having said that, here's what happened. I didn't choose this case, but rather it was thrust upon me with the death of a colleague who was in charge of its investigation. He was a senior detective, 28 years experience. On the morning after the first night of the investigation, he was found dead in his home. His body was huddled into the back of the walk-in closet of his bedroom. The coroner cited sudden cardiac arrest as the cause of death. The bedroom door and the door to the closet were both shut at the time. And the photographs, I'll have more to say about them later. I was given a case file on a family of 3 who were living in a small flat in the West Isle of Wight, United Kingdom. The family were Korean immigrants. There was a father, mother, and an infant girl. The case involved the sudden death of the 38-year-old mother. She was found collapsed on the floor of her bedroom. As the crime scene reports indicated, she seemed to have died while in the middle of applying her makeup. More to follow. The husband, who was initially suspected to be the perpetrator, committed suicide a few days after. He was questioned for 48 hours, then released, due to return 24 hours later. He was found in his van in the garage of the block of flats. A hose was attached to the exhaust, with the other end stuck in the window. The air vents were duct taped shut. The infant girl was never found and was passed on to the missing persons case officers, although now I think she will never, ever be found. When I visited the crime scene myself, things in the flat and some further evidence that I had collected just didn't seem right. I would even say unnatural. Together with a junior detective, I visited the scene roughly 70 hours after the incident took place. It was still classified as a warm crime scene. That is to say, things were mostly left untouched, and as they were at the time of the discovery. Some evidence was removed, however. I'll start with the kitchen. On the counter next to the sink were diced pumpkins, dried and crusty, and in a bowl next to it, some pieces had been mashed into a fine paste. This was presumably for the baby girl. The living room was otherwise normal. It was clean and well maintained. There was a large bookshelf on the southern wall of the room which housed around 50 books. All of the books were in Korean, so naturally I couldn't understand the titles, but when I opened some of them, they all appeared to deal with subjects relating to the occult or traditional Korean pagan beliefs. I gathered this from the photographs and drawings. On the arm of the sofa, a book was open at a page which showed a zodiac calendar. It looked like a traditional Chinese one with all the animals around it. Next to this was a diary, the mother's, open at the yearly calendar page. A large red circle was around one of the dates. Incidentally, this was the date her body was found and the day the daughter went missing. At this time, my partner mentioned he had a Korean friend growing up in London. He added that whenever he went to their house at night, all the mirrors in the house were covered with sheets. He asked his friend about this, who embarrassing said that it was a silly Korean superstition. At night, he was told, witches could enter his world through mirrors. They come to our world to steal babies and bring them back to hell with them. I shrugged this information off when I heard it, a silly superstition. I'd still like to believe that now. On the table in the middle of the room was a small bowl of half-eaten pumpkin mash. There had been something which the initial crime scene investigators had marked on the floor beside the table. There was a long line of something on the floor from just next to the table, which ran across the room, through the kitchen, and into the parents' bedroom, incidentally the site of the mother's body. Taking a closer look, I could see it was a long, thin streak of saliva which contained traces of pumpkin. Every few feet or so between the living room table and the bedroom could be found small puddles of saliva with the pumpkin mixed with it. This suggests, as per the initial police report, that the baby had crawled from the table to the bedroom and came to a stop at the dresser. My partner asked me for permission to go and ask further questions of the residents living on the same floor, and I was left alone in the flat to continue my investigations into the other rooms. It was in the bedroom where I experienced something that to this day I cannot explain. I looked at the spot on the floor where the mother's body was found. The cause of death was ruled as a severe heart attack, and death was instant. This is in spite of her having no history of cardiac illness, nor such any instances in her immediate family. The photos of the body showed her face up, her face suggesting she died in a state of shock or fear. Her eyes were wide open and bulging from their sockets, her mouth jarred agape as far as it could. She was frozen like this, as if someone had shown her a scary image and pressed pause on her reaction. That's the best way I can describe her state in the photograph. She was clutching a hairbrush too. Now I'll tell you about the mirror that was sitting atop the dresser. It was a normal-looking vanity mirror, pearl inlay border, and propped up by a small stand at the back. It looked like an antique. Perhaps it's something I have acquired in my years on the job. Call it an intuitive sense, but I could sense something coming from the mirror. It had a presence, one that was not existent in the other rooms. It was as if the mirror was the focal point of the entire room. It occupied the whole space as if it were alive. What is more, anytime I turned away from it, I felt a sense of being watched. I know it sounds corny and cliched, but I know when I'm being watched. Not only watched, but menaced. It comes with the job and is a necessary survival tool for any law enforcement person. As I was standing in front of the mirror with my back to it, looking at another part of the room, I felt an overwhelming sense of danger from behind. It felt like an impending blow to the head. There was definitely an intent to harm. Startled, I spun around. I immediately noticed my reflection in the mirror. The reflection was of me, of course. But it was me from behind. I was looking at myself from a position behind my body, as if through someone else's eyes. Then the image in the mirror started to slowly lurch toward me. In a flash, I pulled my firearm out of my hip holster and spun around. There was just an empty room, the same as it had been when I entered. I spun back around to face the mirror, gun still held at eye level, and the reflection was of me again, from the front. I stood like this for quite some time, half expecting the image in the mirror to change again. Once my heart stopped beating in my throat, I holstered my weapon and checked around the mirror for anything like a pinhole camera or other device that might make it possible to project an image on its surface from a remote source. A check of the bedroom also revealed no such devices. I decided to take the mirror as more evidence of the crime scene. Perhaps forensics can find something with it and, more to the point, find something that would give me peace of mind about what I had just seen. I put the mirror in a sealed plastic evidence bag and placed it on the back seat, then called my partner's radio to tell him we were leaving. The whole time driving back to the station, I had the sensation that someone was sitting in the back seat. So strong was the sensation, and still feeling rattled from what I had experienced in the flat, I grew fearsome of looking in the rearview mirror. After handing in the mirror to the forensics team, I decided to look over the case photos again, and as I did so, I became aware of a terrifying similarity. All of the deceased, including my senior who passed several days before, all had the same expression on their face. The only words to describe it would be pure horror. The way their eyes had distended in terror, their mouths distorted in their final scream or plea for mercy, and the way they all seemed to be trying to escape from whatever they were seeing. The mother's body was turned in one direction, her head twisted in the other. The father had his head buried into the cushions of the back seat of the car, and the senior detective was cowering in fear at the back of his closet. which contained a full-length mirror. All three had died in front of a mirror of some sort. Had they seen what I saw? That day as I was leaving, I happened to bump into the forensics officer whom I'd handed the mirror to. "Evening, sir," he said. "We had a spot of trouble with your mirror." "Oh?" I said. "Yeah. We couldn't get to the handprint that was left on it." I hadn't a clue what he was talking about. There may have indeed been a handprint on it, but in my haste to leave, I failed to notice it. "Handprint?" I asked. "Yeah, tiny little thing, like this." He spread his thumb and index finger apart to indicate the size of the hand. I'd say they were around 8 or 9 months old, definitely an infant. He shook his head in disbelief. This sent an ice-cold wave of recognition through me. It must belong to the daughter. "What do you mean you couldn't get to it?" I asked. He waited for 2 other staff to walk past and out of earshot before he answered. "Well, the handprint, sir." He looked around again. It had been put on the glass from the other side. "Other side of what?" I asked. "The mirror," he said. My stomach sank, and I instantly thought of the things my partner had told me about the superstitions involving mirrors. "Are you sure?" I pressed him. "We're fairly sure, sir. We've taken thousands of prints from glass surfaces and other reflective materials, but we've never seen something like this." He held up his hands. "It's a mystery." I started to feel lightheaded. He patted me on the shoulder. "But that's for you guys to solve, right?" With that cheerful jibe, he left me standing confused and exhausted in the corridor. I remained that way until his footsteps receded out of earshot. The mirror was never used as evidence, and it was co-signed to a file cabinet somewhere in storage, never to be taken out or spoken of again. The handprint was just passed off as a manufacturing defect. The whole case is now cold, unsolved. 2 sudden deaths of natural causes, a missing child, and a suicide from being unable to cope with the grief. That's how it ended. For me, however, I cover every mirror in the house when the sun goes down. A few weeks ago, on a cool April night, I made the trek to my school's library in one last desperate bid to pass my data structures and algorithms class. I was failing. Admittedly through my own fault, but if I could manage to pull my final project together and make at least an 86, I would scrape by and avoid having to take the class again. So, I threw my laptop, headphones, and multiple energy drinks into my backpack and prepared myself to spend the whole night working. The main floor of the library was pretty empty, but I decided to go to my usual spot anyway. It was a small group of tables on the 4th floor, tucked away in a corner and surrounded by rows of bookshelves. Most students don't make it up to that level. I'm pretty sure most people don't even know you can go to the 4th floor. You can't get to it from the elevator. Instead, you have to get off the elevator on the 3rd floor and take the staircase that's tucked away in an alcove next to a dusty vending machine. They aren't connected to the main stairs, so most people miss them. When I reached the studies tables, there was only one other person there, some older guy intently working on a paper. I nodded to him and sat down, glancing at the clock on the wall. 9 p.m. I winced. Taking that nap earlier had definitely been a mistake. Despite my late start, I managed to work pretty steadily for several hours. I was so focused that I even forgot to pull out any of my energy drinks. When I finally looked up from my barely working program, a couple necessary functions had to be commented out completely or the stupid thing wouldn't even compile. It was right around 2 a.m. I shifted in my seat, my back protesting from how long I had been hunched over my laptop. I needed to walk around and stretch for a bit. I stood up and wandered down an aisle, scanning book titles idly. There seemed to be a thin layer of dust over most of them. I wondered if anyone even checked these books out. I made it to the end of the aisle and rounded the corner, intending to walk back down the adjacent aisle to the study tables, but the end of it was blocked by another bookshelf. I turned around and started to make my way down the first aisle. My steps faltered. The end of this aisle was blocked by a bookshelf too. I slowed to a halt and looked up and down the row. Had I gotten turned around? Surely not. My path had practically been a straight line, but I must have. It's not like the heavy metal shelves had moved in the minute it took me to walk down the aisle. I turned back and started to try the other way again when I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I could feel someone was watching me. Very slowly, I turned my head towards the shelf to my right. Nothing. I turned my head to the left and almost jumped a foot in the air. There was something standing on the next aisle over, peering at me through a narrow gap in the books. Its face was sickly gray and its eyes were wide and unblinking. It didn't react when I gasped. "You scared me," I choked out, taking a half step back. It cocked its head. "Game?" the creature rasped. At least that's what I think it said. I could barely understand it. "What?" I took another step away. "Game! Game! Game!" Its voice grew stronger every time it spoke, as if it had gone unused for a long time. I don't have time for a game," I stammered, another step back. "I have to get to my—" The creature's hand slammed through the row of books, knocking several to the floor. It flailed, long gray fingers grabbing for me. "Game!" the creature shrieked, and I didn't hang around any longer to find out what it wanted to play. I booked it down the aisle and ran as far in the opposite direction from the thing as I could. In my terror, I didn't notice at first that the rows of bookshelves I was running down were much longer than they should have been. The library was pretty big, but I was on the smaller 4th floor. I should have been running over the parking lot at that point. I finally stopped to catch my breath when I thought I had gotten far enough away from that creature. I realized that I couldn't see the walls of the library anymore, only rows and rows of shelves, stocked to the brim with dusty books. I looked through the gaps between the books, trying to find the study area or anything that would tell me where I was, but there was nothing. Nothing but books and shelves as far as the eye could see. Above me, the fluorescent lighting buzzed. I thought about climbing a shelf and looking out over the tops to find my way back, but I was honestly afraid of what I would find if I did. What if I couldn't find the stairs again? What if the library had completely disappeared and the only thing left were bookshelves stretching eternally? I was pulled out of my panic when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I froze, watching for any movement. There it was again, a flash of movement, unnaturally fast. I zeroed in on it. There, several rows away, was the creature, staring at me as if it had never moved. When it caught my gaze, it ducked out of view, and I heard a scampering sound. It sounded like something was running on all fours. I took off, even though my body was still on fire from the last bout of running. I twisted and looped through the rows in a way I hoped would throw it off my trail. Eventually, I slowed down to save my strength. But the whole time, I knew that somewhere nearby, the creature still hunted me. The shelves became more labyrinthine with every corner I turned. There were no more neat lines of adjacent rows. The aisles twisted and turned and branched and stopped dead with no warning. The books looked different, too. Some looked absolutely ancient, as if they would crumble if I tried to pull them off the shelves. Some books looked oddly new. I pulled one of the newer books off the shelf in a moment of untimely curiosity. The front cover was a single word in a language I didn't know. I flipped it open and turned a few pages. To my surprise, they were all blank. It was getting dark then, like the buzzing lights couldn't quite reach me wherever I was, even though I could still see them above me. As I turned another corner, I came upon a small area with no other paths out of it besides the one I came in through. It looked like the bookshelves had been haphazardly pushed aside to form a small clearing, and loose paper from several fallen books was scattered everywhere. I felt my heart thud in my chest when I saw that some of the pages were stained, a rusted brown color that was almost black. I took a step further in and almost tripped over something half hiding under a crumbling book. I kicked the book away and froze in horror. Sitting on the floor in front of me was a human skull, picked completely clean. Suddenly, I knew the truth. All my running had been for nothing. I never had a chance to escape. These shelves weren't a maze, they were a web. The creature had been chasing me here the whole time, getting me slowly, carefully, stuck fast in its trap. And now I was here in its nest, waiting for it to come to dinner. Behind me, I heard the scampering sound again. I whipped around to see the creature peering at me from the end of the aisle. Its body was hidden behind the bookcase, and it poked its head around the corner in a way that was almost childlike. I had seen how fast it could move. I only had a moment to act. "Wait!" I screamed. It tilted its head ever so slightly. My mind raced. "You wanted to play a game, right? Game?" The creature stared, unmoving. "It's not really a game unless you give me a chance to escape. How is it a game if there's no possible way I can win?" As I distracted the creature, I looked around for any way to get out. Luck must have been with me, because I noticed a small gap between two shelves that I hadn't seen before. I threw myself at the gap, barely managing to squeeze through as the creature rushed towards me. I felt fingers barely graze the back of my shirt as I took off running. I took a few more random turns and then, like I'd never left, I burst free of the shelves, back at the group of study tables. The only other person on the 4th floor, the older guy from before who had been writing a paper, gave me a dirty look before focusing back on his laptop screen. I didn't bother to grab my stuff. I sprinted for the stairs, going down them 2 at a time until I hit the 3rd floor. I ran to the main staircase, tearing down them so fast I almost fell, then through the lobby and out the main door, gulping fresh air that I thought I'd never taste again. A couple days later, I asked a friend to check the library's lost and found for me, and she was able to get most of my things and bring them to me. My earbuds were missing, but I didn't care. I considered it a small price to pay for my life. I also failed my algorithms class, but honestly, that was going to happen anyway. For a couple weeks, I thought I was safe. I really did. I thought I had managed to beat the creature and escape its labyrinth. I had thought of it like a spider, something that would catch the unsuspecting fly that stumbled into its web but couldn't give chase if the fly unstuck itself. But now, I know the truth. It had taunted me with freedom like a cat with a mouse, letting me dart out from underneath its grasp, only to snap me back up again in the next second. During the day, I can feel its eyes on me, watching me from dark corners as I make my way around campus, even as I give the library a wide berth. I hear the sound of the creature's movement in my nightmares now, every single night. And every night, it sounds like it's getting closer. So this happened to me almost 7 years ago now. I should give some background info before getting into things. At the time this all happened, I was around 16 years old, and I had a friend I'll call Karen, who was dating a boy named John. At this point in time, Karen and John had been dating for maybe 6 months, and after going out with Karen and John on many occasions, they decided that they wanted to hook me up with John's friend. We'll call him Cameron. At this point in time, I had met Cameron in person once. He was nice, so I gave him my social media, and we had chatted a couple of times. It's important to note, he didn't have my number or know where I live. Now it's time for the story. Fast forward to one night, maybe a week or two after I met Cameron. I'm laying in bed. It's about 2 or 3 in the morning, and I get a call from an unknown number. Thinking, why the hell is an unknown number calling me at this time of night? I decide to answer it and see who it is. So I answer the phone and say hi, and a man responds saying hi back. Since I didn't recognize the voice on the other end, I asked the person who they are. Instead of giving me an answer to this question, the man on the line tells me to look outside my window. Thinking this is probably a prank call, I tell the man to F off and hang up the phone. Once I did this, the number calls back again. Didn't answer it. The person then proceeds to call me another 4 times until I finally answer the phone, which again I ask who the heck is calling. This time the person responds and tells me that one of my friends gave him my number and that I'm the guy he's been talking to. At this point, my stupid 16-year-old mind is trying to rationalize this, and the only person I can think of is Cameron. Before I can say anything to this person, he again tells me to look outside my window. He is outside, and I begin hearing noises outside my window. Now, I should mention that my room is right beside my parents' room, and being stupid, My first thought was that this fool was going to wake them up and I'd never hear the end of it. Let me tell you, that thought soon turned into the last thing I would worry about that night. Anyway, at this point, I'm also starting to get creeped out. I'm thinking to myself, okay, if this is Cameron and Karen did give him my number, how the hell would he know where I live? So I reply to the man and say, Cameron? The man says yes and tells me to look out my window. I reply telling him to go home and hang up the phone again. Weirded out, I decide I'm going to get up and go into my basement and call Karen so that hopefully my parents don't hear me talking from my room. This is really important because to get to my basement, I have to pass a door that is partially made of glass. So I get downstairs and call Karen. She answers, clearly half asleep. I tell Karen about the unknown call, which I'm assuming is from Cameron, and how he is telling me to look out my window because he is outside. And on top of this, that I can hear someone out there. Karen, now clearly awake, tells me she has never given Cameron my number or address and calls John quickly from her home phone to see if maybe he did. At this point, John answers and tells Karen that not only had he never given my information out, he is with Cameron. They tell me if someone is outside, I need to hang up and call the police immediately. So I hang the phone up, and before I can even go to dial for anyone, I get another call. Guess who? Unknown number. So I stupidly answer again, and before I get a word in, the man tells me that he knows I'm in my basement. He saw me walking by my back door. Now I'm clearly disturbed, as I did just walk by my back door to get downstairs, so I know someone is outside. Again, before I could say anything, the man tells me to come outside. So stupidly, I tell the person I'm calling the police and hang up the phone. Why I didn't call the police at this point, I really don't know. Probably because I was 16, stupid, and literally in panic mode. Not more than a minute later, I get another call. Unknown number. I answer again. The man then tells me to come outside or he's coming inside to get me. Clearly panicking at this point, I have this deep gut feeling that if I go outside, I'm never coming back. However, I do have to go by the door again to get back upstairs, and that was equally terrifying me. So I hang up the phone again and muster up the courage to run upstairs because the last place I wanted to be was in a part of my house no one else was in. I get more calls. Unknown number, unknown number, unknown number. Again, my 16-year-old stupidity answers. This time, the voice on the phone sounds shook and says to me that police stopped him outside my house and want to speak to me to make sure I know him. The phone then gets passed off to someone who identifies themselves by name with some title I no longer remember and asks if I know the man outside my address. He says my house number and street. I quickly tell the voice on the phone I don't have any idea who the person calling me is and hang up the phone. Never got another call again. However, I did sit there all night holding a bat and had problems sleeping for months. I should also mention, I don't have never many friends at this point in my life, and looking back on this night, I thought maybe this was a prank taken too far. However, I begged the few friends I did have for months to admit that one of them were the person who pulled this off, and to this day, they all insist none of them did this. So whatever got this person to stop calling me, thank God, and to the unknown caller, let's not meet. This happened a long time ago. At the time, I was living alone in a first-floor apartment. My girlfriend had been sick at the time and ended up in the hospital dealing with a rare disease. She recovered fine from it, but during those weeks, my life was pretty much go to work, go to the hospital to be with her, come back to the house for dinner, and then bed. It was a Friday night, and I was alone, so I decided to distract myself by reading and watching some videos on YouTube. Hours passed, and at 3 a.m. I was in bed with my iPad in hand, almost falling asleep. Then I heard it. I knew that sound pretty well. You see, outside right in front of my bedroom door, there was a long corridor that leads directly to the kitchen. This apartment was in a building built in the 50s, and the kitchen door was old and had become slightly bent. That meant that whenever you turned the doorknob to open the door, it would snap out of its place with a distinct clack sound. That was the sound I had just heard. A lot of thoughts ran through my mind in that moment. Had I dreamt it in my semi-sleeping state? Or maybe the sound was real, but what happened was that the doorknob internal mechanism broke and it opened by itself. Or, of course, maybe someone was in my house and they had just opened the door. At this point, my heart was racing and I started considering my options. I had a broomstick next to my bed. You may ask why I had it there, and to be honest, I had it exactly because I lived alone and thought one day I might be in a situation like this where I would need a weapon. My girlfriend even used to joke about it, but I guessed that my paranoia was now paying off in the most unfortunate of situations. So I decided I was going to take the stick on one hand and grab my cell phone in the other. I would open my bedroom door while calling 911, and if no one else was in the apartment, I would just apologize to the operator on the other end of the line and explain the situation. However, back in those days, my cell phone wasn't yet a smartphone, and it had this feature I found interesting, even though I never used it. If you pressed on a couple of specific keys, it would start ringing like someone was calling you. It was meant to be used when you wanted to simulate you were getting a call to get out of a boring conversation or a tough situation. Clumsily, I pressed on those keys and the phone started ringing. I quickly shut it up, but now it had become clear inside the apartment that I was awake. If someone was outside my bedroom, they'd certainly heard it. What was going to happen? I stopped for a few seconds to hear my surroundings. Nothing. It was dead quiet. I decided to continue with my plan. I dialed 911 with one hand, raised the boomstick with the other, and quickly opened the door. As soon as I did that, someone sprinted in front of me in the corridor and quickly got into the kitchen, closing the door behind them. I screamed, "Hey!" and started pursuing, but a split second later I thought, stop, what if there is someone else in the apartment? What if another intruder sneaks up on you from behind? In front of me was the corridor to the kitchen, but on my left was another corridor that led to the living room and office. The office had the light on, so the intruder had been there, but I didn't know if he had company. I took a step back into the entrance of my room so that I wouldn't be caught off guard. "Sir, are you there?" The 911 operator was calling me on the phone. I quickly explained to him what was happening, gave him my address, and he told me the police was on its way. They had a patrol car nearby, so I should just wait. Then he hung up. The apartment was dead silent. I was terrified. There were only 3 things I had been able to notice in the intruder. He had a light-colored sweatshirt with horizontal black lines, dark hair, and he smelled really bad. In fact, the smell was still in the apartment and I could still sense it. The police arrived after 7 or 8 minutes, which felt like ages. The apartment door was next to the bedroom, so I managed to quickly approach it and unlock the door to let them in. I explained what had happened to the police, and they said that we should go through the whole apartment and check every single hiding space. They had seen situations before where a burglar had hidden himself for a long period, even after the house owners had called the police to later attack them. The apartment wasn't that big, so it was easy to conclude that no one else was hiding there. In the kitchen, it was obvious what had happened. It had these large windows that faced the back of the building where we had a small community garden. I had left one of the windows open, and next to it, on the outside, there was a large drain pipe along the wall. The intruder used that pipe to climb to my window and get in. The police left to go look around the neighborhood for someone matching the description of the sweatshirt I described. While they were gone, I could still smell that horrible odor the intruder had left in the apartment. After around 20 minutes, they came back. They couldn't find anyone. The burglar was long gone. Luckily, he didn't have the chance to steal anything while he was in my apartment, but the audacity. I mean, he must have seen the light on in my bedroom through the edges of the door, and still he tried walking past it to steal something from the office. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I went to the garden in the back to try to find any further clues about the intruder, but couldn't find anything. A neighbor in the building next door was at the window when I called out to her. I told her what had happened. She just smiled and said, "Well, welcome to the neighborhood. We all have stories like that in this place. You should never leave your windows open, and maybe you should consider getting some bars to protect them." The next day, I bought a motion alarm and installed it in the kitchen. I never had another experience like that in the apartment, but, to be honest, I never slept the same way in that bedroom, traumatized by those events. At night, I would fear hearing again the sound of the kitchen door snapping out of place. A few years later, I moved out to a larger apartment in another neighborhood. This time it was on the 7th floor, so much harder for intruders to get in through the windows. So, to the intruder that came into my apartment and smelled really bad, let's not meet ever again. I had been sent to Korea from my university a few years ago. They told me for my major I had to go somewhere in Asia, and my friend had really talked up Korea for me. I knew nothing about it, but I decided, what the hell, and I embarked on a semester-long trip. I had only one serious boyfriend in my life, who I had broken up with a few months prior. I also don't enjoy one-night stands, and wasn't digging the dudes at the clubs in Seoul, but I still wanted to have some sort of romantic experience, I suppose, so my friend recommended I use this dating app to meet English-speaking Koreans. That way I could meet someone and experience the actual dating culture. I thought I'm young, so why not? I was just so eager to have new experiences. Maybe it sounds dumb to try dating in a foreign country, but it worked out for me eventually. Just not the first date. I met him on a dating app after being in Seoul about 3 weeks. Let's call him Tim. I still didn't know the culture or city very well, and was a bit naive about everything. He eagerly wanted to meet for a date after talking to me, and he seemed nice. I should have asked more questions, and I should have noticed that he was not giving me many details about himself. Tim was a guy a bit older than me, but claimed he was a college student. I assumed he had done his military time, all men in Korea have to, and returned to school. We talked for a bit and decided to meet for a tea date near the school I went to. He wanted to come to my dorm originally to pick me up, but I live in an all-women's dorm, and I didn't want him to know exactly where I lived since we were still strangers. So instead, I insisted we meet at the main town center near the subway. He really didn't like this idea, which looking back was a red flag, but eventually, I insisted. The night of the date, I waited an hour for this guy. He was very late. Tim weirdly claimed he just wanted to make me wait. I thought he was kidding and messaged him a laughing emoji, assuming he was just lost. When he finally arrived, he was much smaller than I thought, but a man's height has never been something I care much about. He was also quite thin. Maybe I let my guard down because I didn't see him as physically threatening to me, which was a mistake in the end. Right off the bat, he was way too touchy with me and breathed creepy and heavy. I was so put off with his demeanor. I'm usually very tolerant with different personality types, but this was very odd to me. I had been told that Korean men would be polite and not so touchy on the first date. He was also dressed oddly, like in a business attire for a date, but I thought maybe that it's just a Korean thing. Again, I was dumb and knew jack shit about the culture. Then, the first thing he said to me was, "You're not as white as I thought you were." I thought this was a translation error, but his English was near perfect, so I asked for a clarification, and he said what he meant. "I thought you would be more white. Your skin is darker than I thought, and your eyes aren't as green. Are you pure European?" Now I was officially weirded out. First of all, I'm pretty much as white as you can get. I'm Irish and Scandinavian, so white as hell, basically. So the fact he thought I could have possibly been any whiter was funny. And why did he care in the first place anyway? Why does my skin color matter to this guy? And why is he bringing it up? He said about 3 times on the date how he wished I had greener eyes. And every time I would just reply, "Well, maybe my online photos make me look brighter," and brushed it off as him being nervous and trying to start a conversation. Isn't it funny the dumb excuses you make for people when you're panicked? When we arrived at the tea place, I tried to order a basic raspberry tea, and he stopped me and told me I had to have this special tea. Now, I thought it was weird he wanted to choose my tea for me, but in my head I brushed it off once again. He really insisted I drink only this tea type, and I just agreed. These small details become weirder later. After tea, he asked if we could look around my school. It was dark, but the school is very well lit, so I agreed. And the whole time we walked around, he would randomly stop and grab me for long hugs. At first I let it happen, but then I stopped him, and he just kept trying. He kept grabbing me and breathing hard into my neck. It was so awkward. He also would not tell me any personal details about himself. I asked so many questions, desperately trying to distract him from all the awkward grabbing and to try and get to know him. But he would never tell me anything. He even said at one point, "I'm a mysterious man," like a movie line. He also said something like, "You look so much like my favorite movie character," and I asked who. But he said I would have to figure it out on my own. Finally, he said, "I want to go to a dark area," and in my head I screamed, "Hell no!" At this point, I wanted the date over fast. He somehow knew where there was a wooded area behind my campus, and he said we should go there. I said no, and that I wanted to stay near the main campus in town, but he kept pushing. Finally, he grabbed my arm and started dragging me there. He said, "I can't let anyone see," and I started to panic. I finally ripped my arm away and just demanded we leave and go back to the main road immediately. Looking back, I don't know why I didn't ask for help or get angry. Maybe I was scared, but I just began to book it back to the main road, and he followed. We ended up in front of a hospital near the center of town, and I told him it was time for him to go. I made some excuse, and he was pleading with me to stay. I told him we could meet the next day. I lied, and I would message him. I just wanted to get away at this point. I was pretending it was all okay, just so he would leave. Suddenly, I think he's leaning in to kiss me, and I immediately think, oh God, no. But it was so much worse. Instead, I feel pain in my face. It takes me a second to realize he was biting my face. It was like a dog. I had never felt the sensation before. He leaned his head sideways and bit me on my nose and cheek as hard as he could. I screamed and pushed him away from me. His face looked so freaky, and I barely had time to react in words. Instead, I ran up the sidewalk until I saw a convenience store on the right. I ran to the back of the store and bent down to start crying. The man who owned the store started to yell at me, but I couldn't explain my situation. I just begged him in English to let me stay. I ended up having to buy a popsicle to stick around. God, I wish I had learned some Korean by then. I guess Tim didn't follow me. I peered outside the store and didn't see him. I texted a friend and waited for them to get me to take me back to my dorm. On the way, I messaged Tim and basically told him to stay away from me. I told him he was a creep, that he shouldn't bite women, and something along the lines of me calling the police, and then I blocked him. I was so scared to walk around my school area after that. I was so afraid he would find me somehow. I am so thankful I never let him pick me up at my dorm. I called my mom to tell her what happened when suddenly she said, "Wait, what did he ask you?" She then put some details together and realized that all of these weird things had to do with the 50 Shades of Grey books. At first I thought she was just being silly and overthinking a bad date. I thought she was joking, but oh God, she was right. She had recently seen the movie or read the book or something and knew the details. The eye color and the way he dressed and the tea he made me drink and the random lines he said. It all matches the books and movies. For his dirty little fantasy, my mom thinks he picked me because I look like the girl in that movie to him. It explains why he was so fixated on my appearance, and his whole thing with the biting and trying to dominate me. Even if it wasn't his intention, I later learned that there are some few creeps who seek out foreign girls to dominate and have sex with as like a prize. They call it riding the white horse or something along those lines. On a happier note, this bad experience didn't stop me. I eventually met someone else in Korea and we ended up falling in love. We even did the whole long-distance thing, and now I'm living in Korea studying and working, hoping to marry soon. So I guess I didn't let bad creepy guys stop my life. As for Tim, let's not meet. It's been years, but I will still kick your ass if I see you, and I won't have to bite. When I was 25, there was a short time I was staying at my aunt's. It was her, my 2 cousins, and I. She lives in a nice apartment complex, and her unit is on the lower level. Her living room has a lot of windows that she keeps open for fresh air and for her cats to people watch. Her unit happens to be on the corner near a grassy courtyard path. When I had first moved in, I noticed a man who gave me an off vibe. My cousins and aunt said he lived upstairs and 2 units over, recovering from hard drugs that permanently messed him up. His parents paid for him to stay there as they didn't want him with them. They also said, other than hearing him mumble and say weird things, no one had ever had an issue. My aunt works nights and leaves at 3 a.m. My younger cousin works nights and leaves at 2 a.m. That usually left my same-aged cousin and I, the only 2 there, until we leave for work around 8. For context, it is a very open living room to dining room plan. My aunt always had people staying over, so she has a second couch in the dining room in place of a table. This is where I slept. She stayed on the one in the living room. My aunt has also never been one to lock her doors, until this incident. One night, I'm on my phone trying to sleep at about 1 a.m. and hear a man yelling. He's yelling, "Don't shoot," and banging on the door to the right of ours. 2 male college students live there and just told him he had the wrong apartment and to leave. He says sorry and walks off. I am looking through the kitchen window, which is in direct line of sight from my couch bed, and it's the weird neighbor who sees me and grins. He then walks back to his home. I was unsettled, but not enough to wake anyone else up over it. Told my family nonchalantly the next day in a LOL that was weird way. My cousin and I watch a movie and head off to bed. I have a very hard time staying asleep, but I woke up this time to the feeling of someone watching me. I check my phone and it's around 3:30 a.m., so I know that it's not my aunt or cousin. I sit up and figure I'll go watch TV on my aunt's couch since she was gone already. The feeling gets stronger as I am in the living room. Then, I see the shadow of a person standing still in the grass courtyard looking in. I froze. I immediately go back to my couch to get my phone. As I do, the person is gone. I am now trying to calm myself down and think of waking my cousin up when I hear the creepy man's voice. He is now at the kitchen window, which looks out directly in front of her front door. I drop to the floor, out of his line of sight, and start frantically trying to call my cousin. The man is now saying things at the window front door like, "I'm not going to hurt you," and "I'm unarmed," over and over again. His face is up against the window. Then he starts talking about wanting to pet the cats he saw through the window. I can't get a hold of my cousin. It's been 20 minutes of this at this point. In this completely clown shit situation, I don't have many options. I could jump up and run for a knife, but I'd need to go to the kitchen. I could try to respond and ask him to leave, but I've learned when you underestimate crazy, you lose every time. I now hear him knocking and knocking while repeating his nonsense. I'm doing that ridiculous-looking army crawl snake slither across the floor down the hall now. I see the door handle start to turn. I'm about to jump up when my cousin bursts out of his room directly across from the front door. Now he's not the biggest guy, but boy, he was intimidatingly mad at the circus show taking place at his front door. He starts yelling at the guy that he needs to get the fuck off his porch and that he's calling the cops. The man tries to say, "I'm unarmed. I'm not going to hurt you. Don't be afraid." My cousin goes off and yells, "That's fucking dandy. It's 4 a.m. You need to leave or I'll call the cops. What the fuck is wrong with you?" So the guy backs up with his hands in the air and leaves. Needless to say, we didn't go back to sleep. My aunt was called, who called the apartment manager. The next day when I came home from work, his parents were there, packing moving boxes in a truck from his place. Maybe he was trying to get me to open the door by seeming friendly. Maybe he had a bad trip and really wanted to pet a cat to feel better. We will never know. This happened to me 12 years ago when I was a really naive school kid. The more I reflect on it now, the more unsettling it is. I grew up in a small, rural community which was meant to be really safe. Lots of retirees and young families. I'm a trans man, but was a few years away from realizing that at the time, so I just looked like a young girl. My body had developed early, but despite the Jessica Rabbit curves, I was ridiculously baby-faced. The day this happened, I was wearing the ugly junior school uniform and had my hair in 2 plaits. Aside from the boobs, I probably looked about 10. Ugh. My family lived about 10 miles out of the small town I went to school in, and since it was in the sticks, there was no public transport and I was too young to drive. Normally, I'd get the school bus home, but if I wanted to go to the public library after school, I would go there and wait for my mother to pick me up after she finished work. If anything went wrong, I had nowhere to go. So on the day this happened, I had gone to the library alone and headed to the young adult section. It was very clearly aimed at teens with posters and beanbags and things. Normally, there would be other kids there, sometimes families. But today there was only a middle-aged man sitting alone in one of the chairs. He instantly made me uncomfortable. It wasn't his appearance, which was dirty-looking, badly dressed, balding, overweight, dirty teeth. He didn't look homeless, just like a slob. But this space was clearly for teenagers and their families. He wasn't even reading or anything, just sitting there looking around like he was scoping the place out. His eyes were the scariest thing about him, bugging out of his head as he stared at me. I didn't want to be anywhere near this man. Quickly, I grabbed a few books off of the shelf and went around the corner to sit in a chair on the adult fiction section. This section was also deserted. I opened a book and tried to read, but a few seconds later, I felt eyes on me. I glanced up and saw him staring at me through the bookshelves. He saw me looking and let out this eerie giggle like he was a child caught while playing hide and seek. It made my skin crawl. Ignoring him, I went back to my book. Next thing I know, the creep was quickly approaching me. He sat down in the chair right next to me, so close I could smell stale sweat and cigarettes. Again, the whole place was deserted. I felt sick. He put his face close to mine and said hello. His breath was disgusting. Still trying to ignore him, I said a dismissive hi, not looking up. This weirdo then proceeded to launch into his life story and talk to me for the next hour. I have no idea how much was true. He talked about his stage parents with no explanation of what he meant. He talked about being in the military and how he was detained in a psychiatric institution. He told me he escaped and spent days living in the woods before they caught him. The whole time, I was terrified. I wanted to get a librarian, but I was so scared he might get angry and even turn violent. He had made it clear he was psychologically unstable. At one point, he told me his name and asked for mine. I was panicking too much to give him a fake one. The worst part was when he asked me how old I was. Again, too scared to think to lie, I told him I was 14. I hoped it would put him off. Nope. He brightened up and said he'd wait until I was old enough to marry him. He said I was a good-looking girl, nice, and a good listener, that I'd make a good wife for him. At that point, I hadn't even held hands with anybody. In a huge turn of luck, my phone started to ring. Instantly, I answered it. It was my mother, telling me she was parked outside. Flooded with relief, I told her I'd be out in a moment. Looking back, I should have stayed on the phone, but for some stupid reason I thought I'd be in trouble if I told her about the man. I grabbed my things and told him my mother was here and I had to go. My blood ran cold when he told me he'd seen me before and would be waiting for me to come back. I don't know why I didn't tell an adult. I think I was scared, both of getting into trouble and even more of him getting mad and doing something to me. I was so ill-equipped to deal with something like this and probably hoped if I ignored it, it would go away. The next day I did tell some friends at school. One told her mother, who was horrified. My friend had a lot of younger siblings, and they often went to that library. Often we went together, and they had driven me home before. That turned out to be my saving grace. I have no idea what might have happened otherwise. The day after school, my friend and her mother went to the library with the other siblings, as they were already planning to do. It turns out that this creepy man really had been watching me intently. He was back and proceeded to approach the family and ask about me by name. The mother told him he needed to stop harassing young girls and threatened to call the police. I'm still so grateful to that woman for standing up for me like that. Miraculously, it seemed to work. I never went to the police, but I know I should have. I lived in that area for another 5 years and never saw him again. Before I go any further, let me just say this. I know it sounds crazy, sounds insane, sounds impossible, and believe me, if I hadn't been there, hadn't seen everything I saw, I would say the same thing. I'm sending this out to the internet because it needs to be told. People need to be aware of what happened, and I don't think most of the reputable news sources would believe me. It started a couple of weeks ago on a Friday when my daughter got sick. Bad. Not anything too major or long-term, but bad enough that she couldn't hold food or liquid down for an entire day and was running a fever. Bad enough that her mother, my ex-wife, and I made the joint decision to take her into the hospital that night, to not wait to take her to see the pediatrician on Monday. Bad enough that after they triaged her, they decided to immediately admit her. It didn't take long for them to get her a room and get her hooked up to an IV, after which she fell asleep from exhaustion. Her mother and I were both staying, so we settled in as well. The hospital itself isn't a major one, just a small place for a small town, but it's always had a good reputation, or at least that's what I was told by the townspeople when we moved here. People in the surrounding area know they can get good care there, though major traumas and illnesses usually get shunted to a bigger city hospital about an hour away. That's what made what happened so surprising, at least the first thing that made it surprising. We had been there a couple of hours when it started. My daughter was asleep, and her mother had gone down to the vending machines to get something to eat when I heard a lot of noise and commotion in the hallway. I poked my head out and saw a team of doctors and nurses and EMTs and I don't know who else rushing down the corridor with a person, a man I think, on a stretcher. I heard a few snatches of conversation, something about shouldn't be bleeding like this and how did this happen? And one nurse, the same one who seemed to be assigned to my daughter's room, who said, shouldn't be here, we should send him somewhere else. But I couldn't get a good look at whoever was on that stretcher. Knowing what I know now, I'm glad I didn't. When she got back to the room, I told my ex-wife about what I saw and speculated as to what could have happened to that poor person on the stretcher. She wasn't that interested, and before long, both of us were settling back in for a long, uncomfortable night in the hospital. The only real positive about it was the nurse in charge of my daughter's room, the one who had said something about sending the man away. She was a friendly, middle-aged lady named Linda who told us she had grown up in the area, raised several kids of her own, and decided to become a nurse after they grew up because she loved taking care of kids. My daughter loved her because she was sweet and silly and very gentle, and because she had a rainbow jacket on over her scrubs that she called her happy coat. She told us it never failed to make even the sickest kids smile, and it sure worked on my daughter. Linda had come in and out several times to check on things and had always been bright and friendly, not only to my daughter, but to my ex and I. After the commotion in the hallway, however, something changed. The next time she came in, she looked flushed and didn't have her usual smile on her face. She did her checks like normal, but I could tell she was hurrying to get through to try and cover up something. I thought at first she was just anxious to get home and trying not to let it show. But then I realized it was fear she was hiding. Linda was afraid, and not just a little, but terrified. I asked if everything was okay, but she wouldn't meet my eyes and just answered yes in a very short and clipped tone. She told me that the hospital was mostly empty that evening and that she was only assigned 2 rooms, so hopefully she would be able to check in frequently. After she finished, she moved toward the door to leave, but stopped with her hand on the handle. "I would advise you to stay in the room tonight and keep the door closed. We ask that you don't roam the halls as it could be disruptive to our other patients." With that, she went out and closed the door behind her, still never looking me in the eyes. I thought about what she said, and while it made sense in a way, I knew she wasn't telling me the whole story. Something was going on, and Linda was scared of it and trying to either hide it or maybe protect us from it. I remembered her comment as they brought the man in, and that only added to the mystery of what was going on. My ex had noticed the same thing I had, and we spent a few minutes talking about possible reasons to explain Linda's strange change in attitude. Eventually, though, physical and mental fatigue got to be too much, and we both made an attempt at getting some sleep. My daughter had luckily slept through Linda coming in, so after tucking the blankets around her again, I leaned back in a reclining chair and shut my eyes. It didn't take long, and I drifted off into a surprisingly deep sleep, considering the less than comfortable circumstances. I woke up a few hours later, jumping up, suddenly wide awake for no immediately apparent reason. My heart was beating and I was hot and sweaty, but the strangest thing was the intense sense of dread and plain old-fashioned fear that I felt. I didn't know why, but I was terrified almost to the point of paralysis. I forced myself to breathe slowly and deeply to help stave off a panic attack, and I quickly looked around the room. My ex and my daughter were both still sleeping, and it didn't look like my movements had disturbed them. Everything else in the room looked the same, nothing out of place. That calmed me down some, and I decided that I must have been having a nightmare that caused me to wake up. I thought about hitting the button to call the nurse and ask for a glass of water to help cool myself down, but I didn't want to bother anyone. And besides, I heard movements out in the hall, so I assumed that they were doing rounds anyway. I decided to just poke my head out of the door and ask whoever I saw for the water. I paused with my hand on the door handle, thinking about Linda admonishing me earlier about staying in the room and keeping the door closed so as not to disturb anyone else. But I reasoned that they were already moving around out there, so I wouldn't be bothering anyone. Hoping to not get a lecture from an overworked nurse, I slowly turned the handle, opened the door, and stuck my head out. I first looked towards the nurse's station where I assumed someone would be, but it was empty. In fact, the hallway was empty as far as I could see in that direction. I turned and looked in the other direction and noticed something. The sounds that I had been hearing that I thought were in the hall were actually coming from one of the rooms. In fact, from the room that the severely injured man had been taken to. I took a few steps in that direction, trying to identify what I was hearing, when suddenly the door to the room slammed open so hard and so loud it echoed down the entire hallway. What happened next? Well, this is the part that sounds crazy. That makes me feel crazy every time I think about it. It's what has made me decide to leave this small town where I thought my daughter would grow up, and to take my ex-wife and daughter with me. I don't know where we'll go, but I'm not staying here. What happened next was something stepped into the hallway. It wasn't like anything I've ever seen. It was a man, had been a man, but it was twisted, turned, ruined. I can't don't have the words to describe what it was, how it moved, except that it was wrong in every way. Limbs too long, eyes too big, mouth too broad, but worse, so much worse and beyond worse. Before I could move or react, another abomination, another thing shambled into the hallway. This one was just as wrong and horrifying as the first, but even my stunned and quickly breaking mind identified the remnants of a rainbow jacket, a happy coat that draped what had formerly been Linda. I think that's what triggered my body to move, what triggered the moan of fear and revulsion, what triggered those things down the hall to snap their heads in my direction, to start to shamble, then lope down the hallway towards me, mouths open wide and teeth shining. I was able to slam the door closed and yell to my ex to grab something to help me hold it shut. I must have sounded convincing because she didn't argue with me. The next few hours are a blur. I remember stacking everything movable in that room against the door, hoping it would be enough, crying desperately every time something shoved against the door from outside, trying to push their way in. I remember my daughter in tears, not knowing what was going on, my futile attempts to calm her as the sounds outside the room got louder and louder. I remember finally hearing other voices, human voices, shouting, then the sound of gunshots and an unholy howl. Then finally a knock on the door, a policeman's calm voice telling us it was okay, we could come out. I didn't trust him until he sent a deputy to the window and we could see that he was human. That was a few weeks ago, and nothing has come out in any newspaper or radio or TV show or even on the internet. That's why I'm writing this. I did some research, and apparently there have been reports for a long time in this small town about creatures that attack hunters or others wandering in the woods and dark places, and what happens to those people if they don't die immediately. Supposedly they change into whatever the creature itself is. I guess Linda knew that, recognized the signs on the man they brought in, and tried to stop it. Failing that, she tried to keep me and my family safe the best way she could. I'll always be grateful for that, but it doesn't change my mind about leaving. You see, the gunshots I heard and the howl came when the police shot one of those creatures and managed to kill it. The other one, well, it got away. And ever since that night, I keep seeing something from the corner of my eye anytime I go out in my yard after dark, or anytime I'm coming back from the store or passing through a dark, shaded area. Something that looks wrong, that used to be human but isn't anymore. Something that I think now has my scent and is waiting for the right chance. Something wearing torn strips of a rainbow-colored happy coat. So, for starters, I'm a white girl who lives in the middle of nowhere, Japan, so I stand out quite a lot. About 2 weeks ago, I decided to go watch a movie and get some shopping done because it's very cold where I live and only had summer clothes. Since the closest theater and mall is an hour away, I wanted to make the most of my trip and ended up seeing Joker at around 9 p.m. after I did some shopping. Everything up until after the movie was fine and I had no problems. However, when I went to see the movie, I took notice of this one guy who sat directly behind me. I thought, whatever, because he probably just bought the seat behind me because he liked being in the back of the theater. Also, after movies in Japan, it's very common for everyone to stay seated until the end of the credits. But because it was late and I had to drive back home, I didn't want to wait and got up from my seat. As soon as I got up, the dude behind me got up too. We made weird eye contact, and he just seemed a bit off, but I also didn't think too much of it because it was late. After, I walked to the bathroom and the guy was walking slowly behind me and stopped outside of the bathroom and waited, all by himself, and he was watching me go in. Okay, now that was weird, I thought. So, because I was a little freaked out by this guy at this point, I decided to stay in the bathroom for a little bit longer to see if he'd go away. But nope. As soon as I walked out, this dude was outside watching me. But as soon as I started leaving, the credits for the movie just finished, so 2 other women in the theater exited at that time too. There were only 4 of us in the entire theater. So, as a group, we all left and got on the same elevator. Also, this dude was also wearing a very large trench coat, which added to his creep factor. So, he was also just looking at me while we were in this elevator, and as we were leaving through the entrance doors, I start to walk fast, and then I ran straight to my car, which was far away. And I just look at the dude, and he's just standing there at the entrance, watching me run to my car. As I was about to leave, I saw him wait in his car, and it was turned off. He was just waiting for me, I guess. I decided to wait there too in my car, and he didn't move or turn on his car for about 5 minutes. I was freaked out at this point and drove out of the lot as fast as I could, but as soon as I turned on my car, he turned on his car. But I was too fast for him to catch up, and I drove back home without him following. So, creepy trenchcoat guy who followed me around in the theater and parking lot, Let's not meet.